right. Hey guys, Pastor Todd. So listen, we're going to talk to you a little bit this morning. We're doing a couple of video tutorials. We've gotten some new gear into the Lord's house, and we thank God for that. It's been a wonderful, wonderful thing. We've also gotten some new personnel. So we want to welcome Shamel on board once again. He's been doing a great job, and we just thank God for the growth in those areas as far as equipment and all the things that we try to utilize to do a more effective job at leading the people into the presence of God. And right there at that point, I do want to just kind of reiterate as we start this video, as our praise and worship team and our musicians and the sound and video people, everybody's involved. Our job is, and let's not lose sight of the fact, it is to lead the people into the presence of God. It's not about the equipment, it's not about the gear, it's not about creating the most pristine environment for us as praise and worship leaders and as musicians, but it is actually for us to lead the people into the presence of God and try for there not to be, any distractions that would cause them to miss the opportunity to enter into worship, miss the opportunity to come and to hear from God, and for God to give the direction and the guidance that He wants to give to the individuals that are out there. So we've got to keep that in mind as we continue to buy gear and to learn and do more as far as it relates to praise and worship. We have to not lose sight of the fact that the things that we utilize are just tools. Our job is to lead the people into the presence of God. Our job is to enter into the presence of God. And so we have to be careful not to let the things around us distract us to the point to where we don't enter into worship ourselves, and also to where we don't lead the people into the presence of God. Understand that as a praise and worship leader that you're going to get the attack first. We're going to catch the brunt of what goes on. We are the worship leaders. We're on the front line. We're out there at war against an enemy trying to prevent us from entering into a place of worship. So understand that if a distraction is going to come, if a microphone is not going to work, if something's going to happen with the gear or the keyboard, if the microphones or the monitor mixes aren't where they need to be, we catch it first. And I expect you as professionals to be able to take those hits in stride. If anybody should be able to work through the distraction, it should be the one that has spent years on stage as a worship leader. It should be the one that has spent years on stage as a musician. If a distraction comes, that psalmist, that minstrel, he ought to be able, or she ought to be able to take those hits in stride, take those hits and be able to move forward in the job or in the task of leading the people into the presence of God. So let's, continue to be prayerful and be mindful that when we enter into worship, that things are always going to happen. Stuff is not, I can provide, and we can do everything, Pastor Harris and I, the Lord's house, we can do everything that we can to get you the tools that you need. But we can't provide for you this perfect environment that is not without challenges and is not without some amount of difficulty. So as we continue to move forward as worship leaders and as musicians, as minstrels, let's continue to keep in mind that we will always have those challenges, and it is our job to stand and to continue to move forward even in the midst of those things, okay? So with that said, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the gear that we've recently purchased so that we can make sure that we're on the same page as far as how to utilize that gear. For monitoring, and this is a very important section that we'll go over here. For monitoring, we have a couple of personal monitors, and right now Diego and myself are the only two people that utilize these monitors, personal mixers with in-ear monitors. And in the future, we should hope that we're going to get more and more people to utilize them as far as musicians, if they so choose to use them, or praise and worship leaders, if they so choose to use them. But it's going to take a little while because this stuff isn't cheap to purchase. But that being said, we need to make sure that if you are utilizing this gear, that you understand how it actually works so that you can get the most out of it. So the PowerPlay 16 is a personal mixer, and it is just that, is a mixer. It is not, you can't just go in and turn up the volumes and expect to hear everything. In a mix, it means that you need to put things in their proper place relative to each other so that you can actually hear the things that you need to hear. I'm a keyboard player, and so when I put the keyboards in the mix, I'm going to try to make sure that the keyboards are where I need them to be first, because it's the most important thing for me to hear. For a bassist, he's going to need to make sure that the bass guitar is up in the mix enough for him to hear what's going on. A drummer, he's going to need to hear the drums or what have you. So every singer or instrumentalist has to put a priority on the instrumentation that they need to hear the most. And I can't stress enough that it is not to just hit a button and to just turn it up. That's, you could easily eat up a lot of the space that you have in your mix. You've only allotted a certain amount or a certain amount of headroom when you're listening to these monitors. And if you add too much instrumentation from an instrument that's not the priority for you, it will very easily eat up a lot of the things that you may want to hear. There are certain instruments that are very difficult to hear in this environment. The low end or the bass is one of the instruments that's going to be very difficult to hear. And so you have to make sure that your mix is right. Fortunately, like I said, I play keys, and the keyboards they are a type of instrument that has a lot of mid-range tone. There's the low end, but there's also a lot of high-end instrumentation, and I typically play it around the middle. Vocals will also share a lot of the mid-range tones, and so you got to be careful that when these instruments, you got to know which instruments will tend to clash with one another or share the same frequency ranges, and because they share the same frequency ranges, they compete for the space in the mix. And if you don't take special attention and care to make sure that your mix is set up properly, you will not hear the things that you want to hear or that you need to hear. So for me, like I said, with keys, it's sort of a mid-rangey type instrument. I don't play a lot on the low end because I've got Carl on bass and I don't have to do a lot on the low end down there. But that being said, I have to understand that vocals and things can tend to take up my mix quite a bit. The stems, when the stems play, they share a lot of the same frequency ranges of my keyboard, and so I've got to be careful that the stems don't get turned up so much that my keys get drowned out in the mix, and therefore causing me not to hear the keys at all. Let's talk a little bit about the in-ear monitors. I'm wearing a pair of the in-ear monitors right now. They are the Shure SC215s. These monitors only have one driver in them. You need to recognize that there's only one driver, so there's not a lot of separation. The drawback is that you don't get as much low end. There's not as much low end that you can get out of these particular in-ear monitors. So while they work really well for somebody who is on an instrument like keyboards or something like that, as far as hearing, because it's a mid-range type of an instrument, they may not be the best for a bass guitar player. They may not be the best for a drummer because the drummer needs to hear the kick and the low end. And so you need to understand that there are limitations with these particular in-ear monitors. It's not to say that they can't be used or that they're wrong or that they're not. You just need to understand that there can be other in-ear monitors that have more drivers that would give you a better low-end response. But they have their limitations. I've done some research on some other ones to compare, and what I found out is that these give the attenuation higher than any other in-ear monitors that I've seen so far. 37 decibels, I mentioned before that it will cut down as far as the amount of sound that you're hearing from the outside. So while the other in-ear monitors I've researched may have more than one driver, they may give a better low-end frequency response, they also don't cut out as much of the outside noise. So that can make it still a little bit more difficult to hear some of the things that are being placed in your ear. There's also places that you can go to have custom in-ear earpieces made so that they will customize it actually to your ear so that they fit securely and they fit tightly and they do what they need to do. I can tell you this, if you're not wearing these in-ear monitors properly, the first thing that's going to go, if they're not completely or securely seated inside of your ears, meaning basically stopping your ears up and reducing the sound to the outside, you won't hear the low end. That's one of the first things that will go. So you're not going to get things like bass, you're not going to get things like kick. So you have to make sure that that you're wearing them properly and that you have the right size adapters on them so that they fit into your ear canal and that they actually seat and close up your ears to the point to where the low end is actually being fed. So with that, let me talk a little bit about why we do this or why we want to use in-ear monitors or floor wedges and some of the drawbacks. With the wedges, with the floor wedges, you have to keep in mind that these floor wedges, Carl has one, I have one, Diego has a wedge as well that he can use. The limitations of using the wedge is that the wedges will create more and more volume inside of the house mix. We don't want the house mix to get so loud that it becomes an unpleasant experience for the people out in the congregation. Remember, our first priority is to lead the people into the presence of God and for them not to be distracted. We also need to enter into the presence of God as well. So for the people that are out in the congregation, we don't want to be so loud or so distracting that it keeps them from entering into a place of worship. And for us that are on the stage, we don't want to get so preoccupied with the monitors or the microphones and all those things that we don't enter into worship. At the end of the day, a good service isn't this phenomenal performance by the praise and worship team or the musicians. A good service at the end of the day means that the congregation entered into worship and that the musicians and the praise and worship leaders entered into worship. And it's our job to get them to that place. So a successful service is one that where we all were worshiping God. It's not where the performance was phenomenal. It's not where everything just clicked and was great. We always want that stuff to happen, but we don't want those things to become more important than the actual task of leading the people into worship and entering into worship ourselves. That is what the priority is, and we have to be careful to remind one another and remind ourselves that all of these things, these tools that we use, they are just that, they're tools. But at the point that they get in the way, we have to reevaluate their importance and how we're utilizing them to make sure that they don't prevent us from worshiping and honoring God, or that we don't become a distraction. And so our set was great. It was phenomenal. The band and the music, all of it was wonderful. But we were so loud that the people out there didn't get anything out of it. Then we didn't do our job. We didn't do what we were supposed to do in leading them into the presence of God. So let's keep those things in mind. And so when we're using our floor wedges, the main limitation that I want to bring up is that, it increases the volume of the house mix. And so the front of the house mixer engineer, they're going to turn those things down if need be. So we can only get so much volume from them. Those wedges, they're mono wedges, meaning that all of the sound that comes through the wedges is just going to get clumped into one speaker. You're not going to get a stereo field. You won't be able to hear things on the left or on the right. We won't be able to pan the microphone mix over, or say the drum mix or guitars. You won't be able to move them and get those instruments in your ears in a space all their own to make them easier to hear, much like you would hear when you're listening to maybe your favorite Bose headphones inside of your house, or your home theater system, or whatever it might be. You don't get the luxury of panning all of that stuff and getting separation of the different instrumentation that's in the mix. And so that's one of the drawbacks. The other drawback, like I said, is if it gets too loud, front of the house guys are going to turn it down to make sure that the congregation has the best experience that they need to have. So it's using them. I'm not saying don't, I'm saying know the limitations. Know that we're not going to be able to turn them up so loud that that suits you to taste. I can't allow my monitor, while I may need to hear my board while I'm playing and everything, that's granted, but I can't make my monitor so loud that it messes up the mix that's going out into the house. So if I'm going to monitor from my wedge, I have to know that there's only so much volume they're going to be able to give me. And I have to, deal with that limitation if I'm going to use that wedge. So what is my other option? My other option would be to use my in-ears. If I use my in-ears, then they can't turn me down or do anything to my mix. Now, while I'm on in-ears, let me say this and make sure that it's very clear. There's been some confusion over the last couple of weeks, and I want to make sure that I set the record straight on this. These personal monitor mixers cannot be controlled by the guys in the sound booth. They absolutely have no control over what we hear. They have no control over the volume. They have no control over the levels. They have zero control over what's in this mix. So the good thing about that is that they are not able to remove from us anything that's in the mix. If you're using personal monitor or in-ear monitors and you're using the personal mixer, it is yours. You create your own mix. Nobody has to do anything for you. Nobody has to fix it. But it is up to you to understand the mixer, how it works, and understand your in-ears to be able to utilize it to get the most out of it. So understand that nothing in this mix can be muted in the back. Nothing can be turned down in the back. Nothing can be turned up in the back. There is nothing that they can do to prevent you from hearing what it is that's coming through this personal mixer. Whether or not you hear it right is going to be up to how well you know how to use this equipment and how well you set up your mix. And then once you get that right, that's it. That's your mix. If there's limitations, there could be limitations to the in-ear monitors that you're using. There could be limitations to, there's all kinds of things that can factor in, but what I want you to understand is what you create as far as your mix is concerned, it is what it is. That's your mix. It's yours. And so sometimes we'll see guys take one of the in-ear monitors out of their ear because they're still kind of wanting to hear the wedges. I kind of play that way. I kind of take one out of my ear and I leave one in my ear. So it gives me the detail that I want to have, but it gives me a little bit more of the feel of the room. Now, I can't tell you how to use your monitors. I'm not saying that one way is right and the other way is wrong. What I'm telling you is this: understand the limitations of whatever you're dealing with. If you're going to use the wedges, understand that the guys in the back have the power to turn it down, and they have been instructed to do so when it comes to compromising the sound of the house mix. So we're not going to turn up and try to make the stage great for the 10 people on stage and cause the 120, 130 people out there to suffer. We're not going to do that. We're not going to turn up the mix for the monitors for the musicians, and the musicians are in heaven, even though it's all loud or whatever it might be. They're in heaven, but the singers can't hear a thing. We're not doing that. We're going to continue to try to create a mix that is comfortable for everybody to hear and provide the tools that you need to get you the best results without compromising what the congregation hears and without compromising the other sections that are being utilized: praise and worship, leaders, the band, whatever it is. And so for the band, and so that's just the way that we have to do it. When you're dealing with sound, when you deal with live sound, there's always compromise. You always have to be willing to give a little bit of there's give and take across the board. There's going to be give and take for what we can get ourselves and how we can make sure the congregation is still comfortable. There's give and take for what we can get as musicians and still make sure that we're not overpowering the singers. There's give and take for what the background vocalists are doing in relationship to what the lead vocalist needs to do. You know, I can't have the background vocalist louder than the lead vocalist. I mean, there's always give and take, and we always need to be ready to make the adjustments on our microphones or adjustments on our instruments, or just to make sure that the balance is there. So there's always this thing of us working together and ministering together and listening to one another and understanding what we need to do to keep a cohesive balance and a cohesive mix so that everybody can enjoy. That's the whole thing about entering into a place of worship. It's not this thing of just you and yours and what it is that you need to hear. I can't be it's just all about the keys and I just got to get the, I can't do that. I've got to do this in a way to where it makes my bass player, my drummer comfortable, and I've got to work in a way to where my singers can still do what they need to do. And I've got to work in a way that when we do this all together, that the congregation enjoys what we're doing. I mean, if they walk out of here and their ears are ringing, or they walk out of here and they just didn't enjoy it, then what were we up here for? I mean, why do it if nobody gets anything out of it? Oh, well, I was a singer and everything was great for me. It was wonderful. Well, you're not the only person in here. On any given Sunday, there's a couple hundred people in here, and yeah, I want you to have a good time, as the singer or as a praise and worship leader. But if the other 120 people didn't get anything out of it, then we need to reevaluate, why we're up here and why we're doing what we're doing. So let's always keep our brothers and sisters in mind. If our job is to lead them into worship, then let's be willing to take down and take the hit so that they can get the most enjoyment out of what's going on. Amen? Okay, so we talked a little bit about the drawbacks of using the wedges. First of all, the main thing I need you to know is no one in the sound booth can control this mix but you. No one can turn things off. They cannot mute things. They cannot turn things up for you. They can't turn them down. They can't do anything. So once you create a mix, it is your mix. It is how you have set it up, and no one has control over it, nor can they prevent you from hearing the things that you want to hear. So it becomes very, very important that you understand how to get the best mix out of the unit, because nobody else is controlling it for you. Nobody else is doing anything to create or remove elements from the mix. So the way this is set up, there is a Cat 6 cable that's coming out of the back, and that cable comes and it taps right off of the board pre-fader. Pre-fader means that you get the sound from the board before it actually moves to any EQ or any faders. So they can't, just because they mix something for the house or change the volume of a particular instrument in the house, it's because this is set up pre-fader, you're not being affected by that. They can't do anything to change your mix. They can change the house mix all day long. They can lower the kick, they can lower the subs, they can, as far as what's going on in the house, but they cannot remove the mix out of your in-ears. So that means that the best place to get everything that you want to hear would be the in-ears. There are some limitations or drawbacks to doing that, but just understand that that's the best place to utilize as far as getting a good mix. If you use the wedges, like I said, there's drawbacks to using the wedges. So you can use them, but again, it doesn't give you this type of control. It doesn't give you this type of control over your mix and over what you want to hear. So that's how that's being tapped in. I want to reiterate and just make sure that you understand that they don't have any control in the back. They can't do anything to improve or mess up the mix that you're listening to. Whatever you're hearing, it is what you have created, and I've got to insist that you take the time to understand how to create a good mix for yourself. So we want to start by setting these volumes, the limiter and the overall level of the board, and then you want to go to the main and make sure that it's set at least 3/4 of the way or almost all the way up, so that you know that nothing will prevent you from hearing these channels once you start mixing them. Okay, and then you just start going to the individual channels, starting with the instrument of most importance to you, and mixing that instrument in first, getting its volumes right before moving on to the next instrument of categorized by importance, and then mixing those instruments in until you create a mix. And now, if there's something that you don't need in the mix, then don't put it in the mix. Vocals are going to take up a lot of space, and they're going to take up the space that would be given to keyboards, snares. They're going to take up a lot of mid-range space. So if you don't need vocals in there for the performance, then don't put them in. Don't add anything to the mix that doesn't have to be there. If you need to hear one of the worship leaders or somebody leading a song, then of course, yeah, put them in the mix. But if they don't need to be there, keep them out of the mix, because again, I can't stress enough, you only have a certain amount of space. You can't shove everything into the mix and then wonder why you don't hear anything. It's because you're just throwing in a bunch of sound. You've got to get a mix, you've got to create your mix, and you've got to discipline yourself to know what it is you really need or don't need, and what really needs to be turned up and what needs to be turned down. Okay? It's better for you to turn things down than to turn things up. For instance, if I'm running these stems and if I feel like the click is louder than it needs to be, then turn the click down. You don't go and turn everything else up to match the click, because what you're going to do is you're going to end up introducing too much sound into your mix, and then things are going to distort and they're going to overload. So if something is hard to hear, the first thought that should come to mind is, what's in the way? What can I turn down to make the thing that's hard to hear easier for me to hear in the mix? So, you want to get in the habit of trying to lower volumes more than you want to be in the habit of just going through and trying to turn everything up, because that will never get you the results. That will never get you the results that you want to have. So, and I can turn those, up or down. It just depends on, what I need to hear. So I put the keys in the mix first, and then everything else that gets added to the mix uh, in a way that they don't overtake this space or room that I have allotted for the keyboards, because that's the most important thing for me to hear. All right, so let me give you an example and kind of show you what this would, just kind of an example. We're going to run some of the stems. These stems have drums and everything in them. But let me run this and kind of let you hear. So if you can still hear me, hopefully my voice is up loud enough in the mix for you to hear me communicate this to you. But right now we can still hear the click track, right? I've got the stems are going, right? And we can hear the click track in the mix, okay? Now, my keyboards were my most important instrument. So I can still hear everything. So one of the things as far as tempo is concerned is my click track, right? Now watch what happens when I turn up the stems. You hear the click right now. I can still hear my key, but what happens when I turn up these stems? So as you can see, by turning up those stems, I basically completely lost my kick, my click track, I'm sorry. So you want to be careful that you only, if the click was the most important thing, I get it in the mix first, and notice that click is really only at about it's not even quite halfway yet. But if I know my click is important, I'm going to get my click up in the mix where it needs to be, and then I'm going to pull my stems in as much as I need of them. But I'm not going to crank them all the way, because then I lose my click track, right? And so now we can hear that click, and it's over the top, strong in there right now. And then you got your keys. Now watch what happens when I turn those keys all the way up. So now what just happened right there was that once I turned the keys up, I completely lost my stems, right? The click is loud enough, it's still coming through in the mix, but my keyboard's completely covered up the stems. And so the thing is that, you've got to continue to create a mix. Let me stop this for a moment. You've got to create a mix. It is so easy for you to add instrumentation that's going to cover up things that you want to hear. So when you're creating a mix, the first thing that you want to do is prioritize what's the most important thing that you need to hear in the mix. And then the second most important thing, and then the third most important thing. And so you prioritize and get those things right in your mix first. Because as you noticed, my click was in, the click was just fine. But when I turned up the stems too loud, they covered up the click, you couldn't hear them at all. Then I cranked my click up a little bit, all right? And I left my stems, I turned them up a little bit louder, so I was hearing my click and my stems. But once I crunk up my keyboard, it got to a point to where the keyboard actually completely eliminated the stems that were in the mix. And so you've got to understand that whatever you turn up or, in your mix, it has the potential to remove things out of the mix that you want to keep. So you've got to prioritize, and you've got to actually take a little time and create a mix, not just turn your volumes up and think that you're going to hear everything, because you won't. Those keyboards eliminated the stems, or vice versa. I could turn up the stems and eliminate the keyboard. I could turn up the click track and not hear my snare track. I could turn up the snare and totally get rid of what the bass guy is doing. You have to understand that you've got to create a mix if you really want to hear the in-ear monitors the way that they were intended to be heard. When you're mixing, it is always, always, always better to turn down as opposed to turning up. If you can't hear the click track, for instance, it means that something else in the mix is too loud. If you know that your click track is sitting at the place that it's supposed to be, and it's nearly all the way up, it's not quite at the last dot, but it's all the way up. It's one of my priority instruments, so I've turned it nearly all the way up, not quite all the way. My volume is where it's supposed to be. My main volume is set at a volume where it's nearly all the way up. So I know that all of the volumes, and there's three main volumes, you got to look at your limiter, how much you're limiting, how much the overall level is, and how much the main level is. Get those three things set first before you start setting up your mix. It'll save you a lot of headache later on. But at any rate, once my click, I know that my click is sitting here at the correct volume, and something like click or whatever the priority instrumentation is, when you read this manual or when you take a look at this unit and what it's supposed to do, you can't run things that are top priority down at 2 or 3 or halfway. This unit is not created for you to run something. If keys are your most important thing, keys need to be 3/4 of the way, if not nearly all the way up, if that's a priority instrument for you. So with my click track being where it's supposed to be, I know that it's nearly all the way up, not quite all the way, but nearly all the way up. It's taken up the majority of my mix. So when I play this, I can actually hear my click track coming through. Now, my stems are mixed in a bit lower because I need to hear the click. You crank these stems up and you are not going to hear this click. Watch. So the point is you don't want to lose the elements or the instruments that are important for you to hear. So prioritize, figure out what those instruments are, and mix those guys in first. And then mix everything else in relationship to that so that you don't overpower the instrumentation that you need to hear. If it were kick, you mix your kick in first. Make sure the kick's in the right place before you start adding stems or click or anything else, so that you can be sure that you never lose your kick in your mix. Okay? Snare drums, whatever the instrumentation is. Let's say you're a vocalist. If you're a vocalist, then you're going to mix yourself up high enough in the mix to make sure that you can hear yourself, and then bring everything else in. Okay, so when I'm bringing in keys, if I'm a vocalist, if I'm Audrey, and I'm out here and I've got my in-ears on, and I can hear myself in the mix, I never want to get stems or anything else so loud that I can't hear myself in the mix. So I'm going to pull them back low enough to where I can hear them as a reference point, but that I can still hear myself prioritized in the mix. Okay? And so that's what it is to mix. It's not just let's go through and turn them all the way up and then listen to them. I can tell you now, you'll never hear what you want to hear by doing that. Okay, so you go through and you pick the instrument that you need to hear the most, make that your reference point, and then mix everything else to that side. Okay guys, there's one more thing that I want to show you that I found out by, kind of doing this tutorial and taking a look at what was happening with the personal mixer. I may have read about this, but it totally slipped my mind, and I just realized now. But it's very important. The EQ is actually EQ for each individual channel. If you notice, when you press a different channel, these buttons or these knobs, they light up differently. See? And what that's telling you is that the EQ actually resets, or this EQ is then applied to the channel that you are on. Now, why is that important? It's very important because take an instrument like the kick, how you have EQ'd the kick, or whether or not you've boosted a lot of the low end, is going to help you to hear the kick a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove my vocal right now, and just watch me as I turn these knobs and how it affects the sound of the instrument. I have to remove my vocal, and it's because when my vocal is in here, the mid-range of this lapel microphone, it eats up so much of the mix that you really don't hear the kick that well. And so now I want you to understand this. Now that doesn't mean that when you're listening to your in-ears that you can't have the volume of the microphones in at all. It means that it doesn't need to be this loud. So let's take a look at this. I've got my kick in, but I'm going to reduce the volume of my vocal to a place to where I can still hear but not lose my kick. So now my kick is in place. I've come to about halfway. Now I can hear myself in my ear set, but the kick is there, but it's not as loud as I want it to be. But the more I lower the volume of that lapel microphone that I'm using, the more room it leaves for my kick in the mix, therefore causing me to hear the kick better. And so the lesson here is just simply what I've been stressing and reiterating the whole time. Pick what's important to you. Make sure that nothing else gets in the way. Make sure that nothing else is louder than the instrument that you most need to hear. If it's keyboards, if it's your vocal, whatever it is, don't allow yourself to turn anything up to such a high volume that you can't hear the instrument that you're trying to play to, or the instrument that's most important for you. So whatever the instrument you're on, make sure that that's the one that's predominant in the mix, and then just go through by priority, picking each instrument that you need to hear and adding them to the mix at a low enough volume to where they're heard, but that they don't overpower the main instrument you need to listen to. So the thing about the EQs that I wanted to share with you is the EQ is different for each channel. So every time I change channels, then the EQ basically resets. Now, so on the kick drum, I'm going to show you and just watch the EQ, watch as I turn the EQ. Now here's the tricky thing about it. When you get to a new channel, it may seem as though the EQ isn't doing anything. You actually have to turn it down to get it to light up and then turn it back, and then it'll actually register and allow that EQ to work on that particular channel for you. So like on the toms, the EQ looks like it's set the same as my kick drum. But when I get to toms, these buttons are not illuminated quite as much, and by turning it down and back up, then I'm able to actually engage the EQ on the tom channel. So when I get back to here, this is the EQ set for the toms. When I get back to the kick, the EQ is not set the same way. The point is simply this: however you set this EQ when you're tweaking it, that's the EQ that you're going to have for that instrument. And when you move on, it keeps that EQ and it continues to move down the line. So on an instrument like kick, I'm going to turn my vocal down so that you can hear it. Hopefully it comes through well enough. By putting on a pair of headphones, you might hear it better, you may not. Every set of headphones is different, but hopefully you'll get the idea of what's going on here. And watch as I make changes to the EQ on the kick drum. All right, let's turn this down. And so what I did there, messing with the EQ, just understanding that I boosted my low end as much as I could, and it was making a huge difference in that EQ for the kick drum. And then I took my mids and I turned this frequency down to catch the lower end frequency, which allowed me to actually boost the kick even more by boosting some of the mid lows on the kick in order to get it even up in my mix a little bit more. And so I can't stress enough that you got to mix this stuff, and you got to look at these EQs, and you got to understand how to get the mix where you need it to be. But once that's done, the kick is now set that way, right? And when I move to my next instrument, the EQ is reset for the new instrument. So guys, listen, I hope this helped out a lot. Please take the time to read up about your gear, know what it is that you're using, know the ins and outs, its limitations, know what it is to use the personal monitor mix, what it is to use your wedges, know the drawbacks and the limitations of the different people that you may add to your mix. Make sure that you never add anything to the mix that compromises the thing that you need to hear the most. All right, so we will see you on Sunday, and have a great weekend.